the same use. It is similar to the meaning of the word we use, common. But in a context like this, what would common mean to a Jew? What's that? Derogatory. Yeah, it's a bad word. Yeah, for sure. What'd you say, Angie?
Like a Gentile.
Okay, Gentile. Common, it's sort of the same as our word for common, just a slightly different, whereas it's the opposite of holy, pretty much. Common, if something is common, it's the same as something that's profane. It's been made, you've taken something that's holy, not in the case of hands, but taken something that's holy and made it normal, common. So it's defiled in that religious context. So they're talking about hands that are common, not defiled like dirty, literally. We're not talking about sanitary stuff here, but they didn't wash their hands in a religious, ritualistic way, the tradition of the elders. Now, there's nowhere in the law of Moses that says any such thing as this, okay? This is part of and they didn't even say it was. They said tradition of the elders. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat. That was their charge. That was their accusation. For once, they actually seem to have addressed it to Jesus himself and not to the disciples. Why do your disciples? It's his responsibility. Did he tell all the people to wash their hands when he fed them? No. If they were eating when they came upon them here, was he telling them to wash their hands? Was he washing his hands? No and no. So what gives? Why? Why is this? Well, Jesus, notice, he doesn't even try to answer their question. Dean, did you have something?
Ceremonially, it seems like it was just something that they made a pretense of what they were doing. Their hands were probably already dirty.
Yeah.
Why did they have to wash it again? They just did it for a pretense, just like when Jesus was before Pilate. Remember, he washed his hands, trying to, and just showing that it was a ceremonial type deal. That I guess they just to show how you were adamant about it.
Yeah. Pilate wasn't. He didn't suddenly realize, oh, you know what, my hand's probably a little dirty. I need to wash my hands. But it had a different meaning. It was a metaphorical meaning. My hands are clean of this man and doing anything unduly to this man. So, yeah, in their case, and like I said, it's not in the Scriptures. Some have tried to apparently find scriptural ground for it. Some Jews, I guess I should say, like Leviticus 15:22. Whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening, and statements like that. But that's sort of grasping for something that's not there. There's other statements as well that people have tried to say there's scriptural grounds for it. But even they didn't try to do that. The tradition of the elders. So what is the tradition of the elders? Well, like I said, it's this oral law. It's called the oral law. It's oral because it was spoken. It wasn't written. It wasn't inspired of God as far as like Moses and the prophets and the other writings were concerned. But it was just traditions that are built up over time. The rabbis of old, the elders in this case were not like the elders of the synagogue or the elders of the church even, but it was just men of antiquity who were considered to be authoritative in their commands or their suggestions or their ordinances. So if the elders believed that something needed to be done, that was as good as gospel to most of the Jews, or at least these Jews, scribes and Pharisees. That's all it took. The elders said so, we need to be doing it. And it's God himself may as well have come down and told us, because that's how powerful it is, that's how strong it is. Well, Jesus did not consider the traditions of the elders very meaningful, obviously. And he was not afraid to show it. He didn't have any concern whatsoever for man-made ordinances. And if you've noticed so far, almost every charge that they had against Jesus so far, petty as they were all because he was doing something that wasn't in accordance with the man-made traditions. And almost every case, they overlooked a miracle or something good to charge him of something silly. So if this was back referring to the miracle of feeding the 5,000, they're doing it again. Here he fed 5,000 people plus with just one young man or little boy's food. Ignore all that. You didn't tell them to wash their hands. See how silly that is. Just like you healed a man on the Sabbath day. You miraculously healed a man. But you did it on the Sabbath day. And everybody knows where the law of Moses says you're not supposed to heal people miraculously on the Sabbath day. You would think by how boldly they declared it. So, some Jewish teachers claim that Moses actually gave this oral law alongside the written law, and that oral law had been passed down through the centuries. The problem is, there's no way to back that up, especially if nothing was written of it by Moses. So, we know, of course, that's not true. The law that God gave Moses was written, and we have it to this day. But one of the important things that we mentioned, the Pharisees considered that law, oral law, the traditions, to be just as binding as the law of Moses itself. That was one of the biggest problems. That's why they were in this mess in the first place, because they did not distinguish between tradition and command, inspired command. So the washing of defiled hands, we already said what that is, simply a ceremonial washing. And it got to the point where they even washed after too. So you got to wash before, but you need to wash after also. Why? Who knows? But that was their accusation. Jesus did not even bother to respond to this. Instead, he presented a counter accusation against them. He said, "And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God commanded," and by the way, that has nothing to do with anything going on here. He's bringing up something else. God commanded, "Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die." Notice how Jesus has already got the upper hand, because he is talking about something that God commanded, and he gives the quote. Two different ones. They didn't do that. They refer to the elders and their tradition. "But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, 'What you would have gained from me is given to God,' he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you've made void the word of God." "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" I'll just read Mark's account in verse 6. He doesn't, he says it the other way around. First he mentions Isaiah. Mark 7:6. "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition." That verse could not possibly be more applicable than it is today for many people. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish a tradition. Lots of people in the religious community, even those who claim to be Christian, so to speak, following Jesus, are a little too quick to reject the commandment of God, any commandment of God, in order to establish a tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you've gained from me is Corban, and again, Mark says that is given to God, in case you didn't know what Corban meant, and I would venture to say you probably wouldn't know if somebody didn't tell you, just like me. I wouldn't know if somebody didn't tell me, so I'm glad Mark did. Then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you've handed down, and many such things you do. So Jesus is calling out their hypocrisy, not for the first time and not for the last. In a specific instance, namely the one he just said. The law says, honor your father and mother. People have a responsibility to take care of their father and mother when the time comes that that's necessary. Or in this case, honoring them in that way. And Jesus is implying, obviously, and sort of interpreting that law for us, that to neglect your father and mother, even in that sort of way, is to revile them. And the law said that anybody who does that, that's the death penalty. That's capital punishment, capital crime. But what they had done was developed, or at least sort of invented, this little loophole. Okay? If you give that money, or declare that money even, to God, you don't have to give it for them. And then they would probably have other ways of, then a loophole of the loophole that, this money is Corban. Well, does that mean I give it all to God? Well, maybe not exactly. Maybe some of it. Maybe God lets me keep some of it, that kind of thing. Only some of it goes, the stash that I'm going to keep is also His, but He's just going to let me keep it right here in my little pocket right here. And we have an understanding that it's His. I'm just holding it, and I might use it for things. I might buy something with it, but it's still His. But one thing for sure is that it's not Mom and Daddy's, because it's Corban, and I can't give them what's to God's. Can I give it? Can I give my parents what? See how that? It's easy for men to come up with these little tricks and games. Well, that's obviously what they had done. A loophole to not honor their father and mother in the way that Jesus is talking about here. And Jesus says, this isn't the only instance, this is just one, because many such things you do. You do many things like this. Find little loopholes. But then whenever something of the tradition of the elders comes along about washing silly hands before you eat that doesn't even have anything to do with cleaning your hands or anything, then they make a big fuss. I can't believe you would do this or not do this. You're not obeying the tradition of the elders. But then when God's law comes along, they find loopholes so they can get out of it. It's as corrupt as it can be. So Jesus has got them. I mean, what are they going to possibly say to that? Well, according to the text at least, as far as we know, they didn't say anything. Probably smart. Once again, they come to Jesus with their chests puffed out and all big and bad, and then Jesus really sends them off with their tail between their legs. At least they probably walked away with their chests just as puffed out as it was when they showed up, but at least they knew they were beaten, and they couldn't say anything. We're just going to move along. We'll find another day. We know He's not going to start obeying the traditions of the elders anytime soon, so He'll do it again, and then we'll get Him then. Well, then He's going to turn to the people, okay? Hear and understand. And He sort of changes the subject a little bit, but He says, there's nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. We'll go ahead and throw a caveat in here. Mark himself throws a caveat. I know that the language, it says there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. Well, somebody could easily misinterpret that. There are all kinds of things that I can put into my body that would defile me. Jesus is talking about food. You can see that in Mark 7, verse 19. Thus he declared all foods clean. So by nothing, he doesn't mean literally anything, but any food. The context is food in this case. We're not talking about drugs or anything like that. The things that come out of a person defile him, because those things come from the heart. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, that little parabolic thing he just said. And he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled? A very proper and politically correct way to say, refer to that process. Thus he declared all foods clean. He said, whatever comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts and sexual immorality or fornication, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. It's out of the heart. What comes out of the mouth comes from the heart, and that is what defiles a person. Not what you eat. And certainly not what kind of hands you eat that with, as the connection to what's just happened. The idea would be the same as the vessels that Mark mentioned in verse 4. They also washed cups and pots in copper vessels. Well, if the food is blessed and the drink is blessed or whatever, and then you pour it in common vessels, guess what you've just done to the substance? Now it's defiled. Well, then guess what? If you drink it or eat it, well, now look what you've done. You've defiled yourself because you ate bad food. Well, the same would apply to hands. Unwashed hands, got the food in the hand, now the food's tainted. Put the food in the mouth, chew it up, swallow it, now I'm tainted. I'm defiled. Jesus says, that's a bunch of baloney. No pun intended. It is what comes out. And not food, but what comes out of the mouth, words. And along with that would go actions. Because what comes out comes from the heart. And that is what defiles a person. So, what our discussion for the remainder of our time, as brief as it is, when are traditions bad? Okay? Because that's what this subject is traditions. Traditions are bad, first of all, when they violate Christ's law or God's law. Pretty sure there's no controversy in that statement. But Jesus didn't stop there. Traditions are bad when they're bound on others. Bound on others. Now, Wayne mentioned the meeting times, okay? Meeting times is not as simple as a tradition that's bound on others. Congregations have an obligation to submit to the elders of the church. If they ordain or deem that the church, this congregation will assemble at these times, that's not just a tradition, and it's certainly not a tradition of the elders, because God has commanded the members of a congregation to submit to the elders. So to try to write off a meeting on Sunday night or Wednesday night as just a tradition, and so they don't partake in those things, they are violating the law that God has given us to submit to the elders. It's just one of many reasons why it would be sinful to do that, to neglect the meetings of the saints. Okay, so traditions are bad when they're bound on others. If we do have a tradition, though, and we try to say that if you don't do this, you are not right with God. If you don't skip the third verse in our songs, then you are not right with God. First, second, fourth. Always first, second, fourth. Everybody knows this. Probably that started probably before some of you were born. You skipped the third verse. Maybe not. Maybe it didn't go back that far, but it's probably a fairly recent thing for time's sake or something. Keep your sermon under 30 minutes. What are some other traditions? White sheet over the Lord's Supper, or some sort of cloth. That was before my time, I have to say. I won't ask if any of you remember, can relate to that personally, directly. But there were some people who did not like it when that was done away with. Now, you don't have to say if you lived in the time when the white cloth was over it, but does anybody know why the white cloth was kept over it? At least as far as the tradition goes. Okay, to keep flies off. Now, are we fighting any flies in here? One or two might get in here somehow, every now and then. But there's something that we could do that could probably let a whole bunch of them in here. Open the windows. We don't need the windows open because we have nice, cool air that circulates in here. Therefore, when that came along, didn't have to deal with flies much. So the white cloth, you don't need the cloth over the Lord's Supper. Well, that had been such a long-standing practice that when that cloth was taken away, some people threw a little fit. That cloth is supposed to be there. But guess what? There's nothing scriptural about that. It was practical. And it wasn't needed anymore. That's just one example of a tradition that became so embedded into us that people didn't know how to act or how to deal with it not being there anymore. And we could probably come up with some in our more, closer to home as far as that goes. Things that we would have trouble parting with. And I'm not suggesting that anything that is not scriptural should just be cast away willy-nilly, but there are some things that we could do without maybe. Other things we might need to ask, what's the purpose of getting rid? Why get rid of them? Is there really a need to get rid of them, even if they're not scriptural or whatever? So traditions are bad when they are bound on others, and that goes for individuals too.
One time, the women sat on one side, men sat on the other.
Okay. Women on one side, men on the other.
Yeah, it was a little before my time, but I know here that was true. Women sat on one side and men on the other.
Yeah. I'll bet there are people that could remember a time when you probably wouldn't see a woman's head in here that didn't have a hat on. Well, that time is long gone, and now you will hardly see a hat on a woman now. But if the women all of a sudden started wearing hats again, people will probably think that's weird now. Like, what's up with all the hats? This is weird. So you see, that's just how things, over the years, things change, and people get used to things, and we think that's the right thing. But it's not the right thing. It's just a thing. Yeah, Dean?
Well, just like the one cup.
Yeah, 1 cup. Okay.
We didn't have, we usually had two, but though, just the two glasses that was, you all drink out of it, and think nothing about it.
Yeah. Yep. And, the way we've done it for many decades now, the way we've started doing it recently, I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't like the little things at all. I don't like them, but I don't think they're wrong. I just don't like them. I like the other way, and for multiple reasons, but I don't think it's a scriptural issue necessarily. And finally, traditions are bad when they take on undue significance. That would sort of go to the cloth more and the other things that we've mentioned. But traditions being bound on others when we think that this is the way that a thing is supposed to be. And We need to be able to distinguish between something that I think is right. I'll just give you one example from my own personal life that I just remember growing up. Of course, it doesn't apply to me now because I don't drive to worship anymore. I just have to, take a few steps. But we never were allowed to listen to the radio on the way to worship in the car. And we're a very music-loving family. Music has been a part of our family. Music always. I can hear music right now. It never stops in my head. But in the car on the way to worship, we did not listen to music. We did not listen to the radio. And the reason was because it's distracting. Songs can get in your head, and then when you get there, you're thinking of that, and it's just something that we did not do. Now, I wouldn't ever think that that's the right way that it should be done, and if you do it, then you should be ashamed of yourself. If you listen to music on the way to worship, then you better repent tonight, because you shouldn't do that. No, that's just a tradition that our family had, and that's it. I could make a case for why that is it makes a lot of sense, but it's not a matter of Scripture and command. So we need to be able to distinguish between traditions both in the church and in our own individual lives. So how do we know if a doctrine or a practice is from God or man? The simple answer is the Scriptures. Thank God, literally, for the Scriptures, because that's the only way to know. So how do I know if this, that, or the other thing? Baptism, for instance. Baptism is not a church tradition. Baptism is a command of God. It's not, now the sinner's prayer and all that other stuff like that, that is a church tradition. That's a tradition that somebody made up. The reason I know that is because not a single apostle, Jesus, his apostles, no inspired writer or inspired person ever once told anybody to do that. So I know it's not true. I know that it's not from God. So just like Jesus asked the question in Matthew 21, he put it to his challengers there. It said, baptism of John, where did it come from? Heaven or man? They knew they couldn't answer. They were handcuffed. If we say heaven, then he'll say, why didn't you do it then? If we say man, then he'll say, what about John? Blah, blah, blah. So they just said, we don't really feel like answering this question right now. And he said, well, then I'm not going to answer your question that you gave me. So they knew that was the central question that we should ask for anything. Is it from heaven or is it from man? If it's from man, that doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but it could be wrong. But if it's from man, we certainly shouldn't be binding it on others. If it's from God, however, it's bound on every single human being, period. There's nothing that's bound on a Christian for the most part, as a rule. Of course, there are special instructions to Christians and how dealing with other Christians, like forgiving each other and going to your brother and all those kinds of things. But as a rule, anything that God commands is bound on everybody, no matter what.